Hey, well, welcome everybody. It's great to see everybody here. Welcome to our inaugural event of the year for the Center for Emerging Democracies. It's also our inaugural event as the Center for Emerging Democracies. We now have a new name and we have a new digital identity as well. We're at UMich Democracy, so please do look up our events and hope you'll be joining us beyond just today. The theme for today is democracy in the university. And as I wrote in the in the panel abstract, just to give you a sense of what we're kind of going for here, it's kind of a difficult moment for thinking about both democracy and universities' role in democracies. So, as I described the roundtable and what's to come, universities are meant to be havens for the practice of democracy, laboratories for the study of democracy, and vanguards for the advancement of democracy. But recent controversial events on university campuses and disturbing wider trends toward democratic backsliding raise the question of how democracy and the university interact with unprecedented urgency. So this roundtable gathers leaders from centers for the study of democracy around the nation to discuss how universities can best live up to their democratic commitments locally, nationally, and globally. So the idea for the roundtable today is to bring people together here from other established and wonderful scholars from other centers for the study of democracy, like our own, and really start a collaborative conversation about what we can be doing, how we're doing things, and can all be doing so better. So I'm just going to introduce briefly our four panelists. First on Zoom, sadly, not with us, is Sue Stokes. Sue is the Tiffany and Margaret Blake Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science and Director of the Chicago Center on Democracy at the University of Chicago. Consuelo Amat is the Assistant Professor of Political Science at the SNF Agora Institute at Johns Hopkins University. To her left is Rachel Beatty-Riedel. Rachel is the Peggy J. Koenig 78 Director for the Center on Global Democracy and the Brooks School Professor in the Department of Government at Cornell University. And to the far left, we have Hisham Salam, who is Senior Research Scholar and Associate Director of Research at the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. So there's a certain parallelism to what we all do. And I think it's going to be really interesting to hear. There's a lot of registers and levels at which we can have this conversation. There's how campuses are dealing with protest. There's how campuses can try to deal with problems of misinformation. There's how we can deal with problems of polarization and difference. At what point does political speech become something that is something that's unacceptable? What are the right lines? And at the same time, we're dealing with these national and global challenges of democratic backsliding as well. So I think there's a lot of leeway. There's a lot of latitude that all the speakers have to go with this. I hope everyone in the audience will also feel open to thinking about these things in all these different ways and at different levels. And we'll have a hopefully really great conversation. So Sue, can we open up with you, given that you're online and the wonders of technology could become less wonderful at any moment?
Sure. Greetings, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there, can't really see you except for the panel. And greetings to the panelists. My name is Sue Stokes. I'm as Dan mentioned, I'm the faculty director of the Chicago Center on Democracy, and I'm a political scientist in our department here at the University of Chicago. I also am starting a stint as president-elect, and then next year as president of the American Political Science Association. And I mentioned that because one of the, in addition to the great honors of that role, there is an opportunity for kind of directing a project, sort of a presidential task force, It turns, and the task force that I have been interested in working on is thinking about the university in the context in an era of democratic erosion. And actually, it turns out that our current APSA president, Taeku Lee, has great minds work in parallel. He had a very similar kind of idea for his task force. So we are going to be joining forces and hopefully doing something that is both has a good deal of focus on American universities, but also draws parallels between some of the aggressions, I would say, against universities by political actors in the United States with similar kinds of aggressions that have taken place in other countries where democratic backsliding is a threat or a challenge. You can look at some of the I think of them as encroachments on university internal governance, and in some state cases, a sort of takeover of politically politically hostile forces of universities and colleges, as a kind of parallel, very much a parallel kind of event with the interference with the CIDE, a very prestigious academic institution in Mexico City, or with Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, or with the mostly displacement of the Central European University in Budapest, and I could go on. It's important to us for us to see a kind of continuity between the assaults on universities that have happened in other countries in which democracy is under stress, and those instances on our side in our country. So this project, the task force, I mentioned because we are just at the beginning of planning it, and we're very interested in having input from anyone who is interested, and has any thoughts or experiences that would be useful or helpful, or would like to just be informed about how our plans evolve. But I also mention it because I think we're at the outset of a kind of I hope, kind of deep reflection on the role of the university and the ways in which we can be something other than a kind of victim of political attacks, and the ways in which we can actually strengthen our internal practices at universities so that we have a broader sort of political base outside universities. Dan Slater knows that I was not able to be there today because I had to drop my youngest of 3 children off to college, so I'm officially empty nester as of this moment. And most people, Dan can also speak to this. Parents know universities as places that drain our bank accounts, and places that we hope get our kids ready for school. Although those of us who are academics actually like the idea of our kids studying weird stuff. But getting ready for the workforce, I should say. We as faculty and as administrators at American universities don't do everything we could be doing to build support in the broader society. And I think that's an important thing to dwell on and to think about as we think about how to safeguard ourselves from the kinds of attacks that are happening in our country and are happening around the world on universities. So I would just at a very general level say that I think it's very important that we remain able to speak to broader audiences. And I mean that in a quite a literal way, that we write and publish things and speak to broad audiences, that we translate the sometimes necessarily recondite languages of our fields into accessible languages, English, Spanish, whatever language, Turkish, whatever language we're writing in, so that our work is not impenetrable, and actually what's important about our work can have resonance with broader audiences of students, of people, of graduates, of parents, and so on. I say that highly cognizant that universities are also special places that are, I think, helpfully islands and places where people develop specialized knowledge and use specialized ways of speaking with one another, but keeping that kind of ability to be bilingual so that we really can communicate and build support for ourselves in the broader society. So isolation is not going to be our friend as we confront these kinds of issues going forward. So that's a sort of general set of thoughts that I have in mind with my APSA, with my American Political Science Association hat on. I also, putting on my hat as a director of a democracy center, I would just say that we are trying to live out and model the sort of the principles that I just mentioned, and that these would support, in terms of supporting faculty research, being a kind of forum for faculty members who work in the democracy field to be able to share and critique each other's work, and to serve as kind of generators of new ideas and so forth. But we we also work very hard to reach our students, our undergraduate students, our graduate students. We have, for a number of years, I have maintained a sort of graduate student democracy network, which includes people from the professional schools who are interested in problems of democracy and challenges to democracy. Some of that work is sort of social. Some of it is kind of networking among professionals who have parallel but distinctive interests. We have spearheaded, or we've been part of an effort to put together a part of our undergraduate core curriculum. The University of Chicago puts a lot of effort, a lot of emphasis on our core curriculum. Our students spend a good 2 years or so studying a set of core courses. And we have added a core sequence in the social sciences about democracy. So we want to provide all kinds of settings in which our students can study democracy at more than a superficial level, and can engage in research as well into challenges of democracy in the United States, around the world. I don't want to take up too much additional time, and would be happy to go more deeply into any of these areas. I just mentioned a couple other things that we have been doing at our center, which I think have been helpful at kind of connecting our students, whether undergrads or grad students, to kind of sort of issues of the day to some extent. So we periodically hold sessions that we call Just Ask Me, where a professional, a scholar, a professional in some field relevant to democracy, kind of sits online and lets students just kind of batter him or her with questions. And those have been very easy to plan and very fluid and very successful. Our students really get a lot out of those sessions. So, for example, we have something coming up with Rick Hazen, the elections expert from UCLA. We've done some things with law professors here at the University of Chicago. Aziz Hook has done a couple of sessions on various issues related to prosecutions of the former president. So we're trying to kind of encourage a kind of wide-ranging and sometimes not super formal kind of set of conversations among our students and the broader public, but the broader community as well, about democracy. So I'll pause there and look forward to hearing other people's thoughts.
Thanks so much. Consuelo, do you want to stand up there? Okay, and Consuelo Amat.
Mm-hmm. Hi, Sue. How are you? It's good to see you. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Consuelo Amat, and I'm an assistant professor of political science at Johns Hopkins University, and also affiliated with the SNF Agora Institute for Democracy and Civic Engagement. It's an institute that was founded about 5 years ago with a gift from the Stavros Niarchos Foundation in Greece. And I wanted to briefly mention kind of a little bit about the organization, and then I wanted to go a little bit deeper on 3 things that we've been dealing with as faculty to try to get at these questions of democracy and the university. So first is the 3 pillars that really the SNF Agora Institute has developed. The first one is discovery, which has to do with research. And so within that pillar of discovery really is about the faculty and also the fellows. So we have a set of core faculty, and then we have affiliated faculty. And then the hope for the faculty is that it's really interdisciplinary. So we have political scientists, sociologists, historians, and we're actually trying to hire in psychology, in philosophy, as well as in kind of big data and computer science. And so we really want to broadly understand democracy and not just focus in one subfield, which is, I think, important for developing, this translation and the ability to talk to each other, not just as experts, but also beyond, right? And then we have a group of fellows that these groups of fellows varies from year to year. So these people spend a year with us, and they're usually practitioners. They could be military officers, they could be people from NGOs, government officials, dissidents from other countries that they spend a year with us. And so these are really interesting people. They're practitioners and they study democracy, or their work is on democracy. And we have incredible interactions with them. The hope for the research is to really in the highest aspirations for Agora is really to be greater than the sum of its parts, but it's really hard to obtain that. We have developed this practice of every year we have a retreat with faculty and fellows, and we try to think about how do we build that greater from the sum of its parts. And I think I can think of one example where it has been very fruitful. So there's a research project on defections within the conservatives in the United States. What explains that certain people who are conservative, or even from the Republican Party, who are kind of defecting or expressing kind of courageous dissent against their own movement, right, in the time of authoritarianism or backsliding, and what explains that others don't do that and they remain within the movement even though they wish they would do something. And so for this particular project, there's at least 2 professors from different fields joining. There's an NGO, the Horizons Project, that's also part of it, and then 1 fellow who's Scott Warren. So this is an example of the kinds of work that we want to build that is, we think, really building this greater than the sum of its parts idea for the discovery pillar. The second pillar is design. And in this case, it's really about the practical interventions that our researchers and our fellows have to intervene and to improve democracy. It also has to do with, specifically like labs that maybe professors have. So we have the P3 lab that Hari Han, who is actually the director of the SNF Agora Institute, but she's currently on leave. The interim director is Amy Binder, who's a sociologist. And so we have labs that focus on practical interventions and also really trying to develop engaged research. And when I mean about engaged research, it's really trying to go beyond, although this is important, beyond the op-eds and the conversations in DC, which we really value and they're really important. But we think that engagement with society has to go much deeper than that. And so a few examples is, for example, my work has a lot to do with activists. And so my engaged community is not politicians or people in the policy world, but they're actually grassroots organizers and activists from around the world. Hari Han's work, for example, is also with community organizers, but in the United States and with religious communities, for example. And so we really want to broaden this idea of engaged scholarship that goes beyond the very public, because some of this work has to be more in secret, right? If you're dealing with activists from, in authoritarian locations, you don't want to say that you're having these conversations publicly. Some of this work will be more private and not as public as an op-ed, but really equally as important to reach wider communities. And on that point, I think there's important to set up the structures within the institution to incentivize these things. So for example, the work that I do with activists, conversations with activists and trainings with them from Venezuela, Nicaragua, Sudan, Bolivia, and Colombia, these things are recorded in my service aspect of what I'm doing within the SNF Agora Institute. They're not counted as like one op-ed, but the type of work that I do is also counted in terms of what I'm contributing to. And so it's important to give institutional acknowledgement and incentives and kind of space for broader types of engaged research. Then so that's discovery, design, and then the third pillar is dialogue. And so the SNF Agora Institute, really the Agora, or the Agora, is supposed to be the place where we have a conversation across difference. And so we really want to build that pillar. And the way that we have done it thus far is that we have a whole debate and dialogue program. And so every semester we have about 10 events that have to do with debates and dialogues on big issues that people might care about, whether it's, meat and climate change or, polarization, whatever it is, just current events. People get together. We bring experts on the issues, whether it's from Hopkins or from other places. And then the university's students, whether grad students and undergrads, participate in these debates and dialogues. And it's a way to demonstrate what constructive conversations can be about highly contested issues. In addition to that, we want to build the skills to have these dialogues and these debates. And so what we are trying to do is through our courses that we offer, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, later, but it's through the courses, it's try to build the skills with the students, right? That could be then used and have a lot of touch points through these events that are about dialogue and debate. It's not just the speakers and the experts talking. We then have kind of breakout groups and then conversations in the whole room that develop these skills. So those are the three pillars: discovery, design, and dialogue of the SNF Agora Institute. And now I just want to point to three kind of things that we've been trying to do that hopefully can spark conversation. So the number one has to do with students, right? So what do we do? We're a democracy institute within the university. With respects to students, I'll point to a couple of things. One is for undergrads, we developed a new minor that we call a minor in civic life. Johns Hopkins University is very STEM oriented. The bulk of our undergrads are really not in the social sciences and as in some other places. And so we want the physics major, who's starting out, came from high school, we want them to also get involved in discussions about democracy, building the civic skills that any citizen in a democracy needs to contribute and to feel grounded in their own communities and to solve community problems, right? And so we want that minor to be to reach out to a lot of people, not just be the minor that political science majors do, but much broader than that. And for that, I teach the introductory class to that. And I try to make it very skills-oriented training. We have engagements with Baltimore community organizations that people can participate in as their own city where they live. And then we have speakers from, global dissidents and stuff like that. So it's very lively, very hands-on, kind of low cost in terms of it's not a lot of reading, but it's a very exciting and kind of hands-on experience that we hope that lots of undergrads can take part in. And then with grads, we have the main thing that I wanted to highlight is maybe the career aspects of things, because for grad students who might not want to go the academic route, although there are lots of opportunities for academic career orientation, but for non-academic career orientation, all the fellows that are part of the SNF Agora Institute are incredible resources for all the PhD students, for example, in political science, sociology, history, who they want to interact with people from the real world. Maybe they want jobs in those organizations, in those institutions. And so we try to build a lot of different kinds of programming. We have kind of the academic seminar, and then we have a community workshop. So we call community workshop and then the academic seminar. And so those are in different days of the week. And we encourage students to then have that cross-pollination with fellows and the academic world institutionalized through those workshops. All right, so the second thing I wanted to mention has to do with actually something that Sue brought up about we need to build that base and outside of the university and what people think of universities for us to be successful in not just in democracies that are backsliding, but beyond. So in particular, I want to talk about the faculty and the fact that our reputation as universities in the United States, at least, and in other parts of the world, is that we're a bunch of leftists and that we don't really allow for diversity of opinion, and that conservatives don't have a place, don't have a home in the university. And that's something, whether it's true or not, empirically speaking, there is that reputation that we have. And I think there's really big obstacles and boundaries to that, because first of all, it's an enormous hindrance to our work and the impact that we can have in society if people are just skeptical about experts and what happens in the university. Secondly, public funding for universities and for social sciences and for political science, for example, needs that kind of understanding and support. Why would taxpayer dollars be directed at universities and research if this is all just a bunch of leftists doing work that's not unbiased? And so I think it's a really big obstacle to have this. And so one of the conversations we've been having as faculty in these faculty retreats that I was mentioning is having conversations about how do you diversify the faculty. But this is very, and that's taking the position that we need to diversify. So some people disagree that we do need to diversify. That's why I brought this up, because I think it's a really interesting kind of conversation we can have as a group. This is not easy to solve, this problem. And people have different views about it. But so within the conversation we've been having is, on the one hand, we think that we do need to diversify and we need to bring intellectual diversity, ideological diversity among the faculty. On the other hand, this gets really tricky. How do you recruit right? Based on ideological diversity, if what you're trying to recruit is the best researchers and the best teachers and the best professors, scholars that you need. And it gets even weirder when you think of, for example, okay, so I'm going to hire maybe ideologically diverse someone who teaches math. And so does that really have an impact? Like someone who studies math, but they're conservative, so that does it. So there's a lot of kind of debates that we've had when these faculty retreats that have to do with how do you solve the problem of faculty ideological diversity in a way that matches up with our goals of being scholars, right? Other people disagree with the whole enterprise and think that we actually don't need to do that because we are trained to criticize work and to be as objective as we can, and that's really what scholarly work is. And so even if our own ideological kind of ideas are of a certain type, that the work that we do is not as impacted by those things, given the whole scholarly process of peer review and discussions and everything like that. But I think it's a really important topic we need to discuss of how to address that challenge we have with public opinion and how to solve that concretely with the institutional decisions about hiring. And it's not solved at all. And then lastly, I wanted to talk about something that we're trying to do with addressing current event and current crises. So, the university is going to have all these students, and they're going to bring in a lot of, contention, whether it's with occupying buildings or protests or Gaza, et cetera. And I just wanted to mention a couple of things that we have learned or we have done, and we're trying to really improve on this because it's very difficult. The one thing that we're definitely not wanting to shy away from these topics. We want to head on, meet them in the moment. We are the place to have these conversations. We're saying that we're the agora, right? But it's not easy at all. So one is that the SNF Agora Institute does not take public positions on issues. So for example, the SNF Agora Institute didn't publish a position on January 6th, like what we thought about January 6th. We haven't published a position on Gaza, right? So we have a policy of not taking a particular position on an issue because we think that it could go in very different directions. We would have to take a position on every issue. Otherwise, people can criticize, et cetera. So we don't do that. But we do put on events leveraging the experts we have, right? It's a university. We're supposed to leverage our own expertise to have as informed of conversations about these very hard topics as possible, right? And to then take it from the classroom, the skills you built in the classroom, take them to these events that are with experts to discuss these very, very difficult and intense issues and to model that constructive debate that you can have across different. So I'll leave it there, but thank you very much. I look forward to conversations.
You share your screen?
Yes.
Okay. Seems, how do I make it? It's not working. And then, oh, it's not.
Yep.
The screen? Okay,
Thank you.
of course.
Perfect.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And as Dan invited us to share these thoughts, there are so many different ways to approach it, as he said in the introduction. And so I thought my slice of it might focus on the invitation to think about how universities can best live up to their democratic commitments at the global level, at the national level, and at the local level. And so I wanted to start out by thinking about the global level. And this, very much ties into things that Sue and Consuelo have already mentioned. But I wanted to first think about the ways in which the nourishing of the democratic system happens within universities and to what end for life well beyond the university, not only in our local communities, but also across the globe. And so this can't be a project that's limited to a set of scholars or institutions in the global north. How we think about what democracy means, how we practice democracy, what we claim out of democracy, what kinds of issues we're facing, what we think, to paraphrase Dan, what we think the opposites of democracy might be and how they're articulated in society. Those are questions that must be global in nature. And so too, we can draw lessons, do data analysis, draw from empirical observations, understandings of both what are the threats to democracy, as well as what are the sources of democratic resistance and sources of institutional resilience or structural societal resilience. So I think, we have a lot to learn from one another. I know that in thinking about these questions globally, I certainly have learned from many cases. I think many comparativists have helped Americanists think about how to recognize democratic backsliding in the United States, and also highlighting the perils of and shining lights on opportunities for democratic resistance come from a set of cases where there's always partial but significant democratic victories in places like Guatemala, Brazil, Poland, Senegal, Malawi. We can learn so much from these cases and the pathways and the sequences by which democratic resistance might take place. One of the key messages of democratic engagement then for our students and for our kind of local engagement as well can come from thinking about democracy in these very locally embedded contextualized settings, but that democracy itself is a toolkit that our students, that we as citizens can use to make the governance that we wish to see around us. And I think that this is a really important message for us when we look around the world and we see, the kind of dialogues about democratic discontent and democracy's not delivering, democracy's not, providing the kind of benefits that we want to see from it. And so too, for our students, they can often feel like maybe disengaging or exiting. But when we see that democracy can be a means to an end, focused on a set of governance outcomes, focused on a set of policy priorities that our students care about. So whether that's climate, whether that's gun control, whether that's public health, foreign policy, gender and sexuality rights, economic well-being, public service, getting the damn roads fixed, right? Whatever your objectives are, that governance and democracy, democratic practice, are levers that we use around the world, and we can look around the world to see how it can be used effectively to get the outcomes that we care about. So really, in helping us to pursue those goals with an underlying commitment to nourishing that democracy itself, and then thinking about democracy and democracy for what. But just as we think about democracy for what, we have to pursue those goals with an underlying commitment to maintaining and nourishing democracy itself, right? So that without a commitment to the future protection of democratic rights, democratic liberties, democratic protections, we can pursue ends, democracy and what? I'm going to prioritize the other outcome first and foremost. I want a government that functions, but we can destroy the democratic means along the way. So I think both in theory and in application, our research and teaching at the university, between a researcher network that's global, from concept to practice of democracy, our practitioner networks, a kind of locally embedded organizations and activists, and globally co-taught courses. Recently, a democratic dissident from Nicaragua, who I think has done some courses at Johns Hopkins in Agora, was telling me about a partnership that they do between the Johns Hopkins course and a local small college that has a very ideologically diverse set of students, largely conservative students. And they co-teach this course on a local basis. And the students were talking about the different ways in which democracy in America and its reverberations is felt around the world, right? And so the students had very different views about what they felt the Trump era represented, what they felt Biden's victory represented, what they felt January 6th represented for that reverberation around the world. And so this democratic dissident from Nicaragua allowed all of the students to have Skype conversations or Zoom conversations with other students across this network of dissidents. And so they were talking to students from many other countries who told them how they perceived these different eras. What did the Trump presidency mean for democracy in their own country? What did Biden's presidency mean? And so it wasn't an ideological position of the instructor or even a kind of factual, theoretically informed position of the instructor. But if the question is like, what is a global public responding, to hear it from that global public is a very powerful source. So I think that this speaks to kind of some of the ideological diversity questions, but also a really global network question. Okay, so the second question then is really about national. How can universities live up to their democratic commitments nationally? And I want to suggest here that universities face a really strong tension, I think, between prioritizing at all costs science, being the bastion of knowledge, being the bearer of facts. That is our mission as universities, and that is our integrity, our credibility, our legitimacy in the public realm. So too, do we need to be a realm that encourages innovation, intellectual curiosity, even heterodox ideas, in order to recognize that the world is not flat and we can move forward into new understandings of this complex world around us. So in that way, when we're thinking about this potential tension, how do we uphold facts? I think it's very dangerous to offer false equivalencies and a platform to people to have what looks as this position to be both sidesism, but is drawing upon a platform that is not based in science or knowledge or facts. But it is very important to encourage a platform and channels of imagination and different perspectives and different possibilities of the world around us. And this is the work that we have to do. There are no easy answers, but it's an ongoing responsibility and an ethos of the way in which we connect to our role using university institutions, using the legitimacy of the university, and then in terms of our outreach, our extension to different types of networks. So I know that, University of Michigan, where I come from, Cornell University, we both have a very strong public ethos, and that historically has meant like a kind of extension work, that the university is present in public extension to our state and surrounding communities. But that has been based very much in applied work around agriculture, veterinary sciences, the kinds of science work. But so too, we need to think about the ways in which this has to include civic engagement in our access to information. I think this resonates with what Sue was saying earlier around making information accessible in public spaces, for generating dialogue and ideas that are rooted in public questions, in pursuing research agendas that surround the public good. And then finally, thinking about how we can live up to our responsibilities locally. So universities are engines of social mobility. We are meant to foster the potential of our communities. And in doing so, we have to foster diverse communities that reflect a commitment to learning from different experiences, skills, and talents. Right? That's the strength that we can harness and contribute to a great country and a wonderful workforce and all of that imagination and intellectual curiosity that can carry us forward. So with that mission, we are bound to have disagreement on the fundamentals, even within a community, while we're building our institutions to be able to create that possible difference of fundamentals, right? So we're welcoming more diversity than ever before. We're continuing to seek a truly diverse community that reflects this commitment to social mobility, to foster a breadth of ideological perspectives, and to bring to campus students with different experiences. So there are more opportunities to disagree than ever before. And that puts strains on cohesion, on community membership, and even on the essential to believing that we have a collective aspiration to educate global citizens, that we have a responsibility to one another. Yet, this is a microcosm of democracy. This is why we need democracy, because we should have different fundamental perspectives or different ideas of how things can work and maybe different representative needs. So we have to be that microcosm of democratic practice and have difficult conversations that welcomes those types of questions. So we need to do more of fostering this space for both kind of membership in a community, creating that cohesion that reminds us that we have a democratic commitment to protecting each other's well-being as co-citizens in our university kind of local community, and that we value the expression of different ideas, perspectives, understandings, and experiences above all. So this is really challenging work, and we need to recognize the void that students are coming from. Less than 10% of students have a very rigorous or any exposure to civics classes in high school, right? So we are coming from a democratic deficit when they come into college. And as Consuelo was mentioning, many aren't exposed to it within their different curriculums once they get to the university. So in addition to that kind of void of civics education, our current generation, we included, but our students as well, we're informed by algorithms and feeds that reinforce our priors. We're provided more of what we like to see. We're exposed to less of what we don't like to see. And I have this real sense that coming into contact with ideas that are different is unusual and even threatening to many of our students, especially in this very hyperpolarized world. They don't want to offend, so they are afraid to say the wrong thing, or they might not want to have a debate about something they hold very dear. And so we have to build up these university spaces and skills to have conversations that allow students to confront differences while upholding the respect and the empathy for one another's humanness at core. So this kind of recognition that threats to democracy come from the breakdown of that empathy for humanness and our respect for the rights and liberties of others has to be practiced locally as we see it happening globally. So I just want to end by kind of reflecting on the flip side of the same coin, I think, are freedom and responsibility. The ways that we see democracy is so often in the United States articulated around freedom, right? The freedom to choose, it's my liberties, and I want to get from democracy what I'm promised, which is the liberty and freedom. But in order to guarantee your freedom, we have a responsibility to provide one another that freedom, right? We have to engage in the system and share that freedom with one another, right? So that our freedom is contingent on each other's respect for it. And so I think that universities are really this space in which we can foster that sense of respect and community while we provide each other the freedom to explore it. Thank you.
Okay.
Wonderful. So before I say anything, I just want to start off by thanking the Center for Emerging Democracies, especially Dan Slater, for the kind invitation and for the opportunity to speak with and alongside this distinguished group of colleagues and to learn from their vast experiences and their wisdom. I've already learned so much from them in our roundtable today. I am also very excited about the opportunity to engage with this wonderful community here at the University of Michigan. By way of disclosure and just a quick disclaimer, I'm not speaking today on behalf of my employer, Stanford University, CDDRL, FSI, or any organization for that matter. I'm only speaking on behalf of my own self and sharing my own modest ideas and thoughts. So with that, let me say a couple of things that may or may not be useful springboards for discussion for our roundtable today. So I'm a scholar of comparative authoritarianism. My research focuses on the politics of the Arab world. So not exactly a place that can offer us a lot of insight on the relationship between the university and democracy, largely because last I've checked, we don't have any democracies in the Arab world. But that said, it is a place that is rife with examples of strategies for stifling dissent and speech on university campuses. And I say this with a heavy heart. I see it in my own research. I see it, unfortunately, in the experiences of colleagues who work at higher education institutions in the Arab world. And I definitely see it in my service on the Committee on Academic Freedom at the Middle East Studies Association of North America, the MENA wing to be exact. So we obviously cannot compare our context here in the United States with that of the Arab world. There are fundamental differences that we would need to take a long pause at and reflect upon and think about before we do so. But at the same time, I do believe that the position of the university in non-democratic settings is analytically useful. Why? Because it offers us clarity, a very clear insight as to why it is that wielders of power view academic institutions as a potential source of threat. For one, these are spaces where independent thinking is prevalent and where non-conventional ideas are given a fair hearing, even if they clash with political authority and long-standing social norms and practices. And also, it's a space where by default, you have an abundance of young people with the energy, time, resources, and appetite to mobilize around social and political causes, often in ways that tend to ruffle the feathers of the wielders of power. So that is to say that the university is by default a space where power is heavily contested, particularly during critical moments of political and social upheaval. How do wielders of power contest it? The obvious strategy is, of course, repressive tactics and coercion, speaking of the Arab world, unfortunately. And I'm not going to speak about this at any great length, just because this is fairly self-explanatory and self-evident. But what is less evident, what is more ambiguous, is when the institutional leadership of the university faces direct or indirect pressure to ask of its own academics to hit the pause button and to stop being academics when it comes to certain subjects and conversations. Right? So please set aside all critical perspectives and free debate on this issue because it's too divisive, it's too contentious, it's too controversial, or it's too threatening. In some contexts, it's too threatening to national security or prevalent religious beliefs and dogmas. So if you do encounter this, please, if you don't mind, set it aside, skirt the issue, avoid it, or if you can't, please stick to the following talking points, broadly defined. And if there's one thing, as you all know, that pushes the buttons of academics is when they're asked not to be academics and to basically speak through a non-academic perspective about certain subjects out of politeness or political expediency, right? And why does that happen? Well, that happens because as academics, we are trained and socialized to always have our critical senses on, especially when people are asking to turn them off and set them aside out of politeness and diplomacy. So academics do not turn off. And I think everybody in the room can vouch for this. We are never off the clock. Even when we tell our friends and family that we are off the clock, we are not off the clock, right? We are sitting, if we're sitting with them, we're watching Succession or White Lotus on HBO. In reality, we're sitting there actually reflecting on the absurdities and complexities of cross-class encounters in contemporary America. We may be with our kids watching Aladdin, but in reality, we're actually thinking about the persistence of Orientalism in mainstream popular culture and media in the United States. We never turn off. And because we never turn off, when university administrators come to us and ask us, even in the most polite and sincere and diplomatic forms, to please make exceptions in your curriculum, make exceptions in your classroom, avoid controversy when it comes to certain subjects or contentious conversations, alarm bells go off. And this idea that alarm bells go off, I think, gives us analytical context to what has been happening at U.S. universities here over the course of the past year, since the onset of the war in Gaza in 2023, and the pressures that various institutions have faced to regulate and monitor speech having to do with the war and having to do with other issues related to the politics of the Middle East and North Africa more broadly. And on this issue, I'd like to make one point, and I'll try to be brief, and one recommendation. So my point is that this contention did not start in 2023. And more importantly, and mind you that this is coming from a scholar of the Middle East, this did not start with the Middle East, and it will certainly not end there. So well before 2023, there is a documented record of a host of partisan interests who have been trying to struggle to assert control over what gets taught at US universities on issues like gender and sexuality, race and identity, the history of colonialism with its various present-day manifestations, as well as a host of subjects that have just been, by fiat, declared as by right-wing politicians, opinion shapers, and watchdogs in very polemic terms as the hallmarks of liberal bias in American academia. And of course, this is something that, that's well documented by the Center for the Defense on Academic Freedom of the American Association of University Professors. The center reports that between 2021 and 2023, state legislatures throughout this country issued more than 150 bills, 150 bills that are geared towards undermining the university's autonomy and geared towards undermining and detracting from academic freedom. And in many cases, these bills were tailored to restrict teaching on critical race theory and other so-called, quote unquote, divisive concepts. Of course, this is happening at the backdrop of a much broader and a much more permeating and a much more intrusive process of counter-reckoning that this country has been experiencing since 2020 in the aftermath of after the onset of the Black Lives Matters mobilization and the backlash that it elicited against promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion on university campuses, in educational curricula, and also equally importantly, also outside of the university in other important social spheres. But we cannot separate the university from this. So that is to say that all of this contention and all of this so-called controversy that we've been seeing over the past year is part of, it's not just about the war in Gaza. It's not just about the Middle East, not to detract from the importance of these issues. But this is to say it's part of a much broader and longer struggle and conflict to define and have a say over what is the appropriate framework for studying contentious subjects that have strong bearing on national political debates and salient social conflicts that are happening here in the United States. So there's a lot that I haven't covered here, including the conditions that are shaping the institutional responses from the university towards all of that contention. And I'm just going to go ahead and skip straight to the, to the challenge that Dan Slater gave us as a group, which is what can we do as a research community to address these issues? And my answer is simple. We need to rise up to the occasion and provide a venue and space for studying the political conflicts that are happening around us at the university. The endeavor that we're engaged in right now on this roundtable needs to be expanded into a longer term effort. We need more standing programs, not just a one-off program, one-off seminar, one-off conference. We need standing programs as well as seminars, conferences, reports, studies, courses, and obviously, the issue of being able to actually not to forget, as many of my colleagues here have been mentioning, particularly Professor Riedel and Professor Stokes, and Professor Ahmad as well. You did mention this as well, that it needs to be accessible. It needs to be conveyed in an inclusive language that doesn't lose track of our public education mandates as universities. We need to be more inclusive in how we're conveying these ideas. The idea that we need, or the issues of the threats to democracy that are actually happening in our own domain here at the university. we cannot afford to study political power in Washington and in state capitals and everywhere around the globe, and then choose to ignore it in our own backyard, in our own domain at the university. And finally, I will say, and maybe this is a sub-recommendation, it's implied, but I think it's important to state, we need to uphold the principle of academic freedom in our research, in our conduct, in our speech, in our programming. There are, I think many of my colleagues have talked about this, and I don't need to belabor this point, but we are not a unified community. We have fundamental and important differences within our communities on such polarizing issues, not just the students. We as a community of scholars, we have these disagreements. But the way to resolve these disagreements, the way to address them, is through vigorous academic debate, protected by the principle of academic freedom. Once again, rallying around principles, not partisan interests, not ideological positions, rallying around principles, protected by the principle of academic freedom. We need to defer to the power of persuasion. We need to defer to the power of scientific reasoning, not to the power of the front office of a given university, not to the power of lawmakers in Washington, and certainly not to the power of campus security or the sheriff's office for that matter. We lose so much. All of us lose, regardless of our ideological and partisan commitments. All of us lose if we don't band together and overcome our differences and protect the autonomy of this very unique and important space that we're occupying here at the university. This was my truth. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you so much. I can see why I invited all of these people to come, and why I'm so totally just honored and privileged to have you all as colleagues and as compatriots as we approach these problems. So I want to open things up for Q&A, and I do realize, so we only have one microphone, which I thought would be fine for the panelists, but then I realized people will need to hear the questions online too, and for the recording. So if people could raise a hand, but then wait for the microphone, and so you can be our trustee. So any questions, reactions from the crowd to get us started? Yeah, Nandini, and then Johannes.
Thank you. This was really insightful. I wanted to ask a question to all of you. Any of you can take this up. All of you mentioned sort of civic engagement and engaging with society and broader society and all of that, and I'm completely on board. But I also wanted to touch upon something that is another fundamental, or one of the fundamental role as scholars, which is to teach, right? And I'm curious, just because you are all much more experienced than I am, like especially in political science and sociology, we are teaching these like really fractious topics. And when you're teaching these really fractious topics at times when really fractious things and polarizing things are happening, I'm curious about what the strategies are to navigate something like that, especially in like the more neoliberal tending spaces where like education is almost more like a product that's being sold to students, to tuition paying students, and that's who the university wants to keep happy. So I'm just curious about how to navigate those kinds of positions. Thank you.
Can we collect like several questions? Yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting question, and would add to that the question of whether you're tenured or not. I think, so thank you very much for all these different perspectives. I want to pick up one thing and then ask you to help me think about something that I came in here with, and I think we all sort of have lingering, and at least I think Consuelo brought up explicitly. So the one thing I wanted to pick up on is the idea that that in a way the university is kind of, I think, Dan, you said at the beginning, like a laboratory. It's a modeling space. And I hadn't thought about it as specifically as just now in this panel, how important it is that we model democracy and good governance for students who are becoming disaffected with democracy. In Germany, which I track, the AfD won massively among the so-called climate generation, right? The 16 to 24-year-olds voted in overwhelming numbers for the most autocratic quasi-fascist party. One of the obvious explanations is they've lost the sense that democracy delivers. And so your comment sent me back to the University of Michigan, curtailing a vote by the students about Israel-Gaza. I don't remember what the vote was, and I don't know the details of it, but I know that the university intervened to have a student government vote not take place. And I think I just want to put that back on the table because I think we just undid what we were supposed to be doing. My question is about, and this goes, it comes from something that Consuelo was saying, is about this perception of the university as a hotbed of liberalism or radicalism and so-called viewpoint diversity. My specific question, and I've been grappling with this for a while, aren't we making, it's my assumption, that we're making a mistake by adopting the diversity language for this? Aren't we falling into a trap? The diversity language, whatever you think of it, was designed around a set of principles of inclusion and equity about identities that people bring and that are important to have and have represented. So-called viewpoints seem to me very much what the university is supposed to promulgate and to allow us to figure out. We're not here to figure out, with all constructivist assumptions about race, we're not here to figure out somebody's race or tell Kamala Harris whether she's black or Indian. I think we are here in the social science and the humanities at the very least. I think your math example was interesting, but let's stick to the social science and the humanities for now. We are here to figure out from which, how to engage on certain topics. And I think that's a slightly different question than the way you phrased it, which is about peer review and that we're all objective. I don't think we're all objective. Peer review doesn't make us objective. But the process, to me, it seems to me like we should be doing some work to distinguish the importance of the university in this sphere from the languages of diversity, which we know are embattled, which we know are attackable, et cetera, but also because it's substantively something different. It's a hypothesis that I'm working on. There might be counter arguments to this, but I'd love to hear the panel on it. Sorry to go on so long.
Oh, sorry, proximity. Sorry, that's okay. But please, and then Rebecca, go next. Please.
It's a bit of a follow-up on what you have just said. You all have mentioned, and we witness it all the time, the right-wing assault on the university as an institution. But going back to that language of diversity, the whole DEI project, there's also, it's a very tiny phenomenon in comparison to the right-wing assault, clearly. But there is also some kind of calcification, orthodoxy on the left in a lot of university curricular choices. We are at times reading about things, even the University of Michigan's very own case of Phoebe Glockner. It was a course in 2022 in art history, teaching comics art using misogynistic cartoons, which obviously are the art history, and getting into really huge resistance, attack on a professor, close to cancellation, university administration intervening. So in general, there is this sense that as a university professor, you're almost, particularly in the early stages of one's career, there is this walk on eggshells, on glass. So how to kind of draw the contours is my question.
Hi, thank you so much for organizing this panel. I'm a graduate student in the political science department, and my question is related to Nandini's. So this might be more applicable to universities like Michigan, where we're a big public university and a lot of our teaching staff is actually graduate student instructors, GSIs. And we all want to have these very interesting but fraught conversations. And oftentimes, these conversations are happening in sections led by GSIs. And GSIs do not have tenure. We're in much more precarious positions. And I have seen my colleagues, retaliated against for taking on these difficult conversations. And I was just wondering, you're all very esteemed and tenured professors. How have you thought about protecting your students who you ask to teach in sections for you and to, take on very difficult topics? And I understand the balance of, making sure that you want to protect yourselves and your undergrads too, but I'm just wondering your thoughts on these power dynamics, really.
Once you pass it back, you might not get it back. I can't guarantee more rounds on it. As well, I think there's probably the most. Do you want a minute to collect your thoughts? Okay.
So I really like this intervention here. I think you're suggesting that instead of getting into the debate about DEI and diversity, we should reframe the debate and not get caught into that. And you mentioned specifically viewpoints. I agree with that. Actually, I hadn't thought of it that way, and I think that would be really useful. And to go beyond the same kind of language that could give us a trap, like what you described. I'm not sure what you think of the hiring aspect that I was mentioning and how to get around that and how to change. I think the reframing would be helpful. I'm not sure how far that would go in terms of actually changing the public perception that we want to change around the university. I don't know if even the hiring would help. The hiring changes would even help in changing perceptions, because once the perception is there and it's easy to promulgate those ideas about the university being the hotbed of extremists and all of that, it's very hard to undo those things. And you just need a couple of examples and then people go right back to believing those things. But thank you for bringing up that kind of reframing. That's extremely helpful. I will bring that up for sure amongst our groups. And then on your idea of DEI and the calcification, I like that you brought up that this doesn't just happen on the right; it happens on the left too. I think that one of the things I've noticed the most among my students in this Introduction to Civic Life course that I was describing that I teach is that people are scared to say what they think among their own leftist students and liberal students. So this is not just a problem of kind of the right having this perception or people outside of the university having this perception about us, but it's actually within the university, there's incredible amounts of self-censorship and people not thinking that they can say what they think with professors and also students. So actually, one of the biggest things for me is building that space in my class where people can share what they think. And I have a really interesting story that I could share some other time, but it's about, I had Chinese students who are from our first year's undergrads who just came from high school from China, and I brought a Hong Kong activist to my class to talk about the protest. And one of my Chinese students called this Hong Kong activist, after an hour and a half of talking to him, called him a traitor. And it was a very difficult thing to manage in the classroom. But it's that type of thing that I'm trying to develop, not just in the training of skills, but actually practicing it, because it's the most difficult. You have the knowledge, you have the theory, but when it comes down to something controversial you really care about, it all goes out the window. So it's about practice and modeling what some other person raised. But I'll just cover those two things and I'll let other people chime in.
Sue, do you want to respond to any of the questions?
Sure. Super interesting ideas that were put out there and quite a few of them. So I'll just say a couple of things in response, and also in response to some extent my fellow panelists whose comments I really enjoyed a lot. There I am. So I completely hear the person who, I'm sorry, I don't know who the people are, and I couldn't really see the speakers. So I'll just say the person who mentioned that kind of relatively exposed and vulnerable colleagues are often in a position of taking on in classroom discussions of difficult, controversial subjects and are much more exposed than those of us who have tenure and who are, long in the tooth and so forth. I really hear that. And I don't know what the solution to that is, but I do think it's really important to keep talking about that and to find allies among the tenured faculty, tenure track faculty who can find ways to, strategically help sidestep or avoid or confront effectively those kinds of situations. It's really easy to forget when you aren't in that situation what it is like to be in that situation. So I really hear that. I think that panelists were sort of pointing toward we need to that we are in a moment of attack to some degree from the right. No question about that. I think Consuelo said from the left as well. That is also true. One of the things that I think is helpful about looking at these processes internationally is that, the Central European University was not kicked out of Budapest because of George Floyd being murdered. The CIDE in Mexico City has not been harassed because of DEI policies. So there's something more generic going on. I'm not saying that those have not been real conflicts that have really galvanized both support and opposition to universities, but there's obviously something deeper going on. And my own research into democratic erosion suggests, first of all, there are two flavors of democratic erosion around the world today. There's right-wing ethno-nationalist erosion, and there is left-wing populist erosion, and they're both very real, and they're quite different in terms of the ideological and kind of coalitional basis of the governments that undertake them or the political parties that undertake them. Nevertheless, they present in often in very parallel ways, and certainly with regard to attacks on the university, they present in very similar ways. So I think we need to have a good sort of broad analysis of why we're in the situation we're in. I also think that I am sympathetic to the idea of let's fight back and let's overcome differences among us so that we can fight back in a unified way. But I don't think we're going to achieve unity, and I don't really think that it's, I've been in this job for 40 odd years, and I think that trying to achieve unity among university faculties on any given topic is pretty quixotic and probably not even desirable. So I think what we need to do is, yes, fight back or resist, but do it on the basis of an understanding of why we're in the situation we're in and how to build coalitions. So we're not in sort of a defensive crouch all the time. So we are working from positions of greater strength because we have students who understand that even though we all may disagree about things and have somewhat different values, that we have methods for conducting research that will get us closer to some kind of solid understanding of the phenomena in question, so that we will convince alumni and parents that we are working on problems that are tough and that we're bringing intellectual honesty and hard work to those problems. So I think that's the posture that we need to try to approach. And I'm really interested, Consuelo, by what sounds like a very kind of healthy debate within your institute about diversifying ideologically. And my own feeling is, first of all, I salute you for recognizing that there are biases in hiring. I remember, I don't know, it was probably 25, maybe longer years ago. I had a graduate student here at the University of Chicago who was a very brilliant student, a lot of overlapping interests with my own. We worked together closely and was very conservative. He was a, conservative Christian, very strong Catholic values. We disagreed on a lot of stuff. political stuff. But when he was getting ready to go out on the job market, we had a very honest conversation in which he came to me and said, look, people just don't like my politics. I can talk myself out of jobs. And it was shocking to me to have to recognize that I knew exactly what he meant, and that I found myself telling him, to avoid certain topics, even though they had nothing to do with the research and shouldn't have mattered. So I applaud Consuelo for recognizing that. On the other hand, I really think, and I agree here with one of the questioners, I really think it's a mistake to think that what we're doing is hiring on ideological principles. That shouldn't be what we're up to. We need to not be biased against potential recruits, faculty recruits on ideological principles, or graduate students for that matter. But we also are we need to be hiring on quality and research and people who are asking good questions and who are rigorous in their pursuit of answers to those questions. I think it would be a shame to turn ideological orientation into a basis of kind of diversity in hiring.
Sue, thank you so much for that. I totally agree with what you are saying, and I will add with trepidation that I have heard now numerous university presidents see ideological diversity as their new answer. It's the way that they are thinking about how to talk to trustees, et cetera, around how we're approaching DEI in this constitutional and social moment. So I think this is a really important conversation for us to continue to have, exactly along the lines that you've suggested. And I think it gets a little bit even more complicated. Like I agree exactly with what Sue has said. I think one of the challenges that I see, having previously been directing a kind of area studies and international studies program, is that post-colonial approaches or critical race theory, those in certain departments, those are the lines that are, that's how the line is advertised. And so, so I think it is difficult to think about, the posting of a position that might advertise for something different, a different approach. So these are questions about how departments and disciplines choose to constitute themselves and the kinds of important questions that they're foregrounding. And yeah, I think that these are very important questions to continue to debate. But I wanted to kind of weigh in on two related points, which is one is that in thinking about universities as kind of like the new neoliberal product to the student is the client, where power is held within universities is continuing to evolve. And we see that in the United States, students are one client. Alumni and trustees in particular are a huge client. And that is where a lot of power is held. And state and federal governments are another place of power that are, as Hisham mentioned, trying to legislate or strip away protections potentially from universities as places of this public mission. And so one interesting idea is to think about those bodies as parts of our targets of thinking about where power is wielded in our civics education mission, right? That we should be offering these civics minors to our trustees to think about the university. Seriously, we should have this conversation about what do universities owe democracy with those leaders who think that universities should be run like a corporate board, that you can come in and crush your employees or your members and say, get the job done, produce X widget. That is not our social function. And we need to continually be reminding our broader community about where power is held and what our social function is. And I want to add a third element about where power is held, and this really relates to what Consuelo was saying about the Hong Kong example. Transnational repression is also affecting freedom of expression on our campuses, and the ways in which students feel free to speak about a whole variety of issues. And so that is another, when we look at our global relations and move out of, kind of just our institution or national view, that is a huge element that we also must address. And then kind of thinking about the reactionary movement to inclusion and DEI, right? The kind of grappling with gains that have been made over the last decade, and which are very serious gains that have been made. And the Supreme Court decisions around affirmative action mean that this year's admissions class has record lows in terms of diversity on standard underrepresented minority measures and metrics. This year is a sharp cliff, and all of the data is coming out like now, this month, in terms of the incoming classes. And we don't have the tools to fully measure it in the ways that we used to, and we don't have the tools to think about hiring in these ways. So some of our toolkit has already been stripped away. And so kind of rebuilding spaces for those controversial dialogues and debates is a core part of what we need to do, but we're already doing so from a constrained position in the face of this kind of reactionary movement.
Thank you so much. Excellent set of questions posed by the audience and also by the panelists. So I'm going to be brief here because a lot of the questions have been addressed and I don't have a whole lot of wisdom to add to what has already been said. But I will mention something on kind of one of the cross-cutting questions is the question of diversity and university responses or the theme of diversity in university responses to the contemporary contention that is happening at the moment at a lot of US universities. And I think there is a real danger for the question of diversity or initiatives that are aimed to be sensitive to questions of difference to end up actually collapsing into sectarianizing and homogenizing initiatives. And I definitely see this in a lot of contexts. I'm not talking about my home university. I said I'm not talking about my employer. Speaking of hitting the pause button, right? Practice what you preach. But anyway, so, but more generally, I mean, we see it across the board where we have this response, obviously in the wake of, and, we're taking a step back and we're thinking about this more, more theoretically. In a lot of cases, we see the university leadership taking sort of initiative and saying in the wake of the current contention and controversy, in quotation mark, in the wake of the war in Gaza and everything that is happening, why don't we have an initiative to, have a bunch of leaders sort of coddle our Jewish students and other group of leaders coddle our Muslim students and make sure that everybody's okay, make sure that everybody's having a good experience. But the problem with that narrative, first of all, it's reinforcing these fault lines, and it's also unempirical, and it's completely off mark. The notion itself that, you don't have Jewish students who are supporting Palestinian rights is faulty. As a matter of fact, in many of those cases, you look at the data. Let's actually practice what we preach. Let's actually go to the sit-ins and protest and see who's protesting. What are the signs saying? What are the groups that are actually taking part in that contention? If this is the unit of analysis, or if this is the issue at stake for that we're concerned with. In many cases, you have a lot of Jewish organizations actually taking part in this, which kind of breaks into that narrative that somehow a sectarian response or a sectarian colored response will actually address the problem. What it doesn't address is the free speech issue, the academic freedom issue, which I think gets lost. Obviously, some element of, these responses are important. I mean, we can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Anti-Semitism is a serious problem that has to be addressed. And by default, it will take on the form of, commissions that are concerned with issues that are facing a particular group of students. Islamophobia is a serious issue that has to be dealt with. But within these responses, we can't lose track of the free speech issue, the freedom of expression issue. And we can't use that sectarian lens to look at everything deductively. We need to listen to the students. We need to look at what they're saying, even if we disagree with them, even if we're looking at this as a problem, as a quote unquote situation that needs to be addressed. We need to listen to them, and we need to see what they're saying. We need to hear them out. The other issue is that I do think the question of the governance of the university and the various stakeholders that are putting demands on the university, I think this is a critical issue, and I'm very glad that Professor Riedel mentioned this, because we do have this clear phenomena, this Yelp review phenomena, that every university today, which may speak to the fact that we're, maybe people who are doing work on this can actually kind of like weigh in, but which speaks to this idea that the, corporatization of the university is creating this dynamic where every time a university gets a bad Yelp review, somebody publishes an op-ed, somebody makes a statement in Washington about this, the university, alarm bells go off. Speaking of alarm bells go off. And then we have to do something about it. And the responses are often haphazard, not well thought out, and once again, are kind of like made behind closed doors in a very PR way that doesn't think thoughtfully about the long view, about the long term, about the interests of the stakeholders within the university, particularly when these statements are actually discrediting important stakeholders at the university. Speaking of graduate students, be it instructors or students or in or outside of the classroom. I obviously have more to say, but I'm just going to leave it at that and give people an opportunity to chime in. Thank you.
Well, you guys are all so erudite. I feel like everything that's been said, I feel like that'd be a great last word. So I hesitate to actually provide any kind of last word, but just one thing I would just notice, in the comments. So, the charge for today was to think about these three possible roles universities can play, right? So, a haven for the practice of democracy, laboratory for the study of democracy, vanguard for the advancement of democracy. And I would just note that the vast majority of what we discussed today was about the first two roles. Like, are we being a haven? Are we practicing democracy? How are we studying it? And we've spent a lot less time thinking about how we could actually push for and actually be vanguards for democracy, which I think speaks to the fact, it signals that we're really on the back foot, because we are just sort of thinking about how to even make it work, make democracy work here, how do we even practice it, how do we try to study it, and I would just sort of note that, like, what does that look like? Well, I did make a statement on January 6th. I think it's one thing that we can do. I think there are times when the basic democratic principles as we understand them are so totally egregiously violated that it is part of our role to speak out on these things. We can try to be in some small way a vanguard. I'd also just say I'm glad, it was great for Hisham to be speaking so much about his comparative context, because for me, I'm coming to this from, the place I study most closely is Indonesia. And in Indonesia, students at universities are the vanguard for democracy. They have always been the vanguard for democracy. There was just in recent months, basically the legislature in Indonesia was trying to pass a bill which would in effect have eliminated all local elections in Indonesia. And the students, as they do, they were the heroes. They stood up, they protested, they got it reversed. It's what they always do. So the clearest way to my mind that universities can be vanguards for democracy is through our students and through the power of our students to protest, and by the power of our students to actually call to conscience things that are wrong and things that are amiss. And at a moment when around the world protest is being criminalized in so many ways, it's more important than ever, I think, to be incredibly careful in how we treat protests on university campuses, and to make sure that that oxygen is there and that possibility for student speech to come out and to actually be, again, the call to conscience that we need. Because if not here, then where? The answer is nowhere. So with that, I will end. I want to thank Adam, Zaire, Natasha, Rosa for all the help getting this event set up. Most of all, I want to thank our incredible guests, Sue Stokes, Consuelo Amat, Rachel Beatty-Riedel, and Hisham Salam. You guys were wonderful. Thanks so much for coming out, and the work continues.
Thank you, guys. If you have like any more questions, I'm so sorry we couldn't take more because we are running out of time, and then they're kicking us off this room. So, please just like keep in touch, and then make sure that you subscribe our newsletter on our website, and then we will like keep you posted if we have like new events. Our next roundtable will be on October 8th. The same, we will be here at the Michigan League on Room D. So see you next time. Thank you guys so much, and then take care.